What I wanted to say is, I've been involved in a lot of panels and sessions that have data-driven or data-informed in the title. So data-driven justice, data-based reform, data-informed strategies. And when I'm involved in something like this, I always sort of think two things. One is, that's broad. that covers a lot. And the second is, what do we even really mean by, say, data-informed strategies? And I think that when we say data, what comes to mind is, complicated computer algorithms or sophisticated statistical techniques or reducing individuals to numbers. And there can be a portion of that comes into play when we talk about data in the criminal justice system. But fundamentally, data is information. Maybe an obvious point, but I think it's worth coming back to. And you know how in high school the worst way you can start a paper is Webster's defines love as, or Webster's defines freedom as? So I apologize. But Webster's defines data as individual facts, items of information, or statistics. So statistics are part of it, but information and facts come first. And statistics, after all, what are they but assemblages of individual facts or pieces of information? Now, by saying this, I'm not in any way minimizing the concerns of folks who have issues with the use of data in the criminal justice system. Those are very much valid. But while we can't lose sight of those issues, I think it is really worth bearing in mind what data really is. And so when we say data-informed strategies, we're really saying fact-informed strategies or information-informed strategies. And when you think of it that way, is it really an innovation? Is it really a new thing? And I think in criminal justice, unfortunately, in a lot of ways, it is. Which brings me to my second point, which is going to perhaps be even more obvious, which is that data is absolutely crucial to virtually all criminal justice reforms. But the quality of data and access to data in the criminal justice system is really nothing short of abysmal. I've been in this field for about 6 years now, and I honestly don't think there's been any project that we've pursued where access to data or quality of data was not an obstacle. Often a surmountable obstacle, often only by jerry-rigging things, but you can get over it. But it's something that is always present. And so I think that one of the challenges for us is that we don't have data. And I'm not even talking about data to prove which interventions work or don't work, or which policy reforms are effective or ineffective, although of course we lack that data as well. But I'm talking about something even more basic, which is descriptive data. How many people are in your jail? Who's being arrested? What are the charges? How long are people staying in jail? What's the demographic breakdown and racial breakdown at each point along the way? And on and on. There are as all of you know in this room, very, very few jurisdictions who can answer those sorts of basic questions, which means that very few jurisdictions can actually, in a descriptive way, map out what is currently going on in their criminal justice system. Again, from a descriptive standpoint, purely what's happening today. And if you can't do that, if you can't map out the status quo, how can you identify the most important problems? And beyond that, if you can't identify the problems, how can you begin to solve them? So really, this lack of data is a tremendously fundamental one, and one that really sort of stands in the way, I think, of lots of things that all of us are trying to do. So on this panel, you're going to see examples of, I think, two things. Many of the folks here will overlap in both. One is creative, often ingenious ways, I think, of gathering the data, right? Trying to pull together that descriptive picture of what's happening right now. And the second is leveraging that data to make particular policy or practice changes. So we have a very exciting panel here today, and I will introduce each of them very briefly now and then give you a little bit more information about them as I introduce them to speak. So we have Caroline SARNOFF, Assistant Director of Data Outreach at Measures for Justice. Next to her, Adam Gelb, Pew's Public Safety Performance, Director of Pew's Public Safety Performance Project. Angela HAWKEN, next to me, is a professor of public policy at the NYU Marin Institute of Urban Management and director of the Litmus program. And PHILLIP Goff is the inaugural Franklin A. Thomas Professor in Policing Equity at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, right here. So I'm going to hand it over to Caroline in a moment, but just to tell you a little bit more about her. And I'll actually let her say what Measures for Justice really is. But she's the Assistant Director of Data Outreach there, and when you hear more about what Measures for Justice is, you'll understand what an important role that is within the project. At Measures, Caroline is responsible for the design and implementation of Measures for Justice's national data collection strategy, including outreach to federal, state, and county level criminal justice stakeholders. Before joining Measures for Justice, she was senior analyst at Abt Associates, working with clients such as the Executive Office of the White House, the National Institute of Justice, the NYPD, and the U.S. Bureau of Justice Statistics. I will hand it over to Carolyn right now.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, hey, the mic got turned on.
Should we keep
What?
this one?
Mic got turned on.
Hello? Sorry. Well, thanks, Matt, for that exciting introduction. So I'll do the quick 2-sentence overview about what Measures for Justice is, just in case no one here is familiar. So we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. We collect existing criminal justice data to populate a series of performance measures. They address 3 goals, which are public safety, fiscal responsibility, and fair process. The performance measures span the entire system. So some of the measures have to do with crime and arrest, and they go all the way to post-conviction. And then we populate the measures at the county level. One thing that kind of struck me today and sitting in on these panels is that, when we go to these conferences, we love to talk about America's criminal justice system. And one thing I've really learned at 4 years at MFJ is that it's a system, but more accurately, it's 3,000 plus criminal justice systems. And they all operate with their own autonomy, and it is just as important for the tiny counties as the big counties to have access to sort of consistent and reliable, transparent data. So this is really where Measures for Justice was born, and this idea, sort of what you were talking about, access to just sort of basic information, right? Like you probably know your the best hospital in your town or the best elementary school, but you probably couldn't say too much about how many people are in your jail. So we just wanted to make it the standard that you could sign on to a free data portal, which I'm going to show you, and answer these questions about the county systems in America. So I'm going to sort of start by telling you, a little, yay! Okay, you got to make it work 4 more times, so. So, in 2015, I embarked on, which was sort of like the soul-crushing endeavor of driving to every single county in Wisconsin, trying to get case-level data from prosecutors and sheriffs and public defenders and police chiefs. And I had my little rental car, and I would drive all day, and sometimes these tiny little offices, and they would stare at me like I was speaking another language, because I kind of was. And one day, I drove into Winnebago County, Wisconsin, which is Oshkosh. We've all heard of Oshkosh Bagosh, right? And I went into, which I was assuming to be another contentious meeting with a prosecutor where I requested his data. And I walked into this conference table, and there was just like paper everywhere. And he was like, "Are you the data girl?" I was like, "I am the data girl. Have you heard of me?" And he just started, his name was Christian Gossett. He was like a conservative district attorney, and he had spent pretty much 8 years trying to make sense of the data that he had in this like really robust case management system. It had all these canned reports, it was pushing out data to him, and he was trying to tally things and figure out his racial disparity. And he said, "I've got this like one measure." And I said, "Really? That's great. We have like 32. He said, "Okay." And so for me, that was like this light bulb moment that even in rural Wisconsin, is there a district attorney just waiting for someone to knock on the door and help them use this data? So with that said, I want to tell you a little bit about what the final product is once we get people like Christian's data. So it all goes online to our data portal. You can just navigate to measuresforjustice.org. You can click here. You would click on data portal. You're going to get a little starting point. Obviously, anytime you collect case level data from 300 plus counties, people are going to have a lot of questions about the quality of that data, how you define a case, all of this kind of stuff. So before you even go into the website, you can go through here. You can understand that we only look at adult criminal cases. You can read about the data quality. It's going to tell you, hey, we are not talking about causation or correlation here. We're just trying to give you some starting information to have a deeper conversation about what's going on in your county. Tells you how we define a case. You have some context, some county, all this kind of information about more data. And then you would just click, obviously, I understand. And then it takes you to a map of all of the states that we've populated so far. So you'll see right now, if you go to our website, we have 6 states. That's over 300 counties. So about 10% of the country we've been able to measure so far. And right now we have Washington, Utah, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Florida. We have 4 other states in the works right now. That's Missouri, Arizona, California, 5 counties in Illinois. And our goal is to measure 20 states by 2020. And we're hoping, we have a little bit of a tipping point here where people start to really value county level criminal justice data. So what you would do is you just sort of navigate over a state. It's going to tell you, like in Wisconsin, these are the years. We're looking at 2009 to 2013. We're going to update these data every 2 years. So eventually you can look at another, probably, hopefully very soon, a cohort, the next 5-year cohort of data, and the next 5, and the next 5. And, the number of measures varies, right? So in Wisconsin, we have 22. In Florida, we have 20. And so you would just click on your state, and you'd explore. And then you can navigate the measures in a bunch of different ways, which is really one of my favorite things, right? So if I just wanted to, say I'm going into a meeting and I am maybe in the jail, or I'm talking about a pretrial risk assessment or something, I could just keyword search bail. It's going to give you all of MFJ's measures that address bail. Or you could say, I really want to have a conversation about fiscal responsibility. Let me go to the goals here. Let me navigate to all of our measures that are specific to fiscal responsibility. So you can kind of click around however you want. Right now it's showing you all of the measures we have available in Wisconsin. And I'll let you guys go and look at all the different measures, but just to show you process, I'm going to show you cases dismissed. So when you click on a measure, it's going to navigate you. You can opt to take a little tour. It'll show you around. I don't need to do that right now. So it gives you a heat map, right? So the darker the county, it's telling you the higher percentage of cases dismissed. You can read a very simple definition of what's happening here. You can also click for a long definition. It's going to tell you why we like this measure, why we think it's important, how we calculate it, any exclusions, where we source the data from. And, I might not be super familiar with Wisconsin, so I could also choose a bar graph, okay? So every bar you see here is a county in Wisconsin. Your red line is the state average. What I love is that behind this table this is a very data-driven table, right? There's some rigorous analytics going in, but all you have to do is scroll over a bar, and it's going to tell you in very plain English what's happening, okay? In Dodge County, about 19% of filed cases were dismissed. When I'm playing around with the portal, I might pick some on the high end, some right here on the average, and some down here at the bottom. And then you can scroll down and start to really look at this, right? You can see, all right, how many cases were processed in these counties? How many were dismissed? Maybe I want to look at this measure in companion with another measure, like the number of cases that resulted in conviction. A big thing that we've heard is that people want context, right? So we pull all of this data from the census, the community survey, UCR. It's all right here for you. So you don't have to go to 5 different sites to look at a county. We've pulled it in. So you can look at population. You could look at the number of criminal justice resources. You could say, okay, how many judges, how many prosecutors in each of these counties? Poverty indicators. We have the legal context. Okay, so any of the Wisconsin statutes that might affect this measure are here for you as well. And I want to go back, and then you can also, I almost forgot the coolest thing, you can filter every measure, basically. So say you want to say, all right, I want to see cases dismissed, but I want to run it in a way that I can see, the male versus female, if there's any difference in the distribution of how cases are dismissed by gender. So you could filter here, it's going to show you the disparity, right? So it's saying in Marinette, male defendants had their cases dismissed more often than female defendants by a ratio of 1.14 to 1. You could also filter by offense severity. You could look at offense type. It's going to break it down for you, okay, of cases dismissed, how many were violent, how many were property, how many were drug offenses. So you can see how you can just sort of keep going and dive deeper. And if you want, you can download the raw county level data right here into a CSV. All of the legal context, all of the footnotes is here for you to access. We also have a very intelligent share button, which means if you spend 20 minutes on the website creating your perfect portal tour, you don't have to recreate it. You can just send it right to someone and it's going to take them exactly where you went. So to sort of wrap up, I just wanted to show you one measure that was very important to Christian Gossett. So Christian wanted to know about the counties, about how his county looked when it came to failure to pay low monetary bail. So basically the percent of his jail population who was there because they couldn't come up with $500 or less, right? They were nonviolent, they were low risk, whatever. They just needed $500, but they couldn't come up with it. So what we did is we looked at, so we're gonna add in Winnebago here, we're gonna add in Christians County. And basically what you're seeing is that in his jail, about 40% of the population is there because they can't pay $500 or less. And Christian got really excited when he saw this because he thought, like, this is something I can fix, right? Like, I can talk to the judges. We can do things over the weekend. I can speed things up on my end. So and Angela's going to talk a little bit about the long-term implementation of something like this, but he used this data to start a conversation with the judges, with people in his office. He found out that just by implementing better, sort of release and review processes, he could save his county $45,000 a year. And that was all based on this one little data point, right? And he was able to sort of run with it. And that's sort of our best case scenario, is that these county level stakeholders will look at this and they'll begin the conversation to then, maybe work with someone like Angela or, a local university to really implement change based on this data. So is that 12 minutes? Good? Okay.
I'm not sure if my mic works, but I'll at least hold it up. So I should have mentioned at the start that we're going to be reserving, hopefully with the tech difficulties, we'll still have roughly 20 minutes for questions at the end, but because I'm the moderator, I'm going to take license and ask Caroline one question now that I've always wondered about. Do you have 100% of counties in the 6 states that you identified that you've worked with?
Yeah, I think in Utah's a little unique. Their court data is a little different, but yes, for everyone else, not every measure is populated for every county. But
and how do you convince? I mean, I assume that you don't walk into every room and have someone like that. How do you convince them if they're holdouts?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I found that the barriers to sharing data tend to actually be really simple, which is that it can be a burden to share your data, and if you can reduce the burden on that agency to share the data with you, that takes something huge out of it. And a lot of the people that we request data from are elected officials, and it can be really scary for a sheriff or a prosecutor to turn over all of their data, which then they feel like can be held against them. And I think we just try and sort of flip that argument on its head and say, well, don't you want to know before you run for election if there's an issue that needs to be addressed? And I think they can relate to that. And then certainly anytime we can make a fiscal or monetary argument, they're going to get that.
Great, thank you. Now I want to turn to Angela HAWKEN. Angela, as I said before, is Professor of Public Policy at NYU, and she is also the founder and director of BetaGov, which I think is a really interesting and cutting-edge program. I'm biased because we do fund her, but it is true regardless of that. The idea of BetaGov is really to work closely with practitioners, have researchers work closely with practitioners to identify areas for policy and practice improvement, and to perform rigorous research that is directed in part by the practitioners so that it's directly policy relevant. Angela has a very distinguished resume that I won't go into, but suffice it to say she's been involved in a lot of high-profile, very important research, including the first RCT of the HOPE program in Hawaii. So, Angela?
Thank you. I'm going to take this mic, which may or may not be working. I think it's not working. Well, hi, everybody, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I'm so embarrassed. I've been in New York for 1 year, and this is my first time setting foot into the building of John Jay. There's something wrong with that, isn't there? And it's completely my fault. So I created BetaGov just a few years ago, and I have to give a shout out to several of my colleagues in the room who are here and are amazing too. Because I was really frustrated with the status quo, and I realized I was pushing, at the time, had just crested over into 40, and I was thinking, you know, if I'm going to do things on the traditional academic timeline, I'm going to achieve very little in my lifetime, and I'd like to hope that by the time my children are adults, we would have moved the dial, and we aren't getting there quickly enough. So it was really born out of frustration. So when I'm asked to introduce myself, I often introduce myself as a recovering economist. And this was the problem that I saw. I just come off of the back end of a massively expensive evaluation where we actually ended up learning very little. And thinking back, and again, being this like post, you know, I'd already done I'd bought the bad car, I'd done all the stupid things you do when you turn 40. And I thought, how are we going to shake this up? And I thought, this is how I see the problem. And the problem in the top left-hand corner is what I call traditional academic research, and that it's just too slow. The timelines are so long that by the time we have answers from a question, that person who called for the study has moved on to another position. Because chiefs of police turn over on average every 18 months, so do secretaries of departments of correction, and for Health and Human Services secretaries, it's not that different. So the research timeline and the professional decision-maker timelines are just disconnected. The other problem I ran into was what we call gotcha research, that research was often being kind of used against decision makers, and there was no safe space for them to engage their own data. We saw this a lot with prosecutors, like they were actually kind of scared of letting researchers in because they were elected, and one that describes it to me as, I let researchers in, and basically they just came in to characterize how much I sucked, and then they told the world how much I sucked. They basically put a value on how much I sucked, and now I know nothing except that I suck. Can you help me learn? And we did, and it was really because we created a safe space for them to be willing to use their data towards some positive end. The other big problem I still see, and we're trying to move the dial on this, is research is just too darn expensive. When it's expensive to do, this is what happens. You create a monopoly. Very few people get to decide what gets studied. And what gets studied gets to become the best practices, right? So when research is expensive, does the incarcerated mother with 2 young children get to raise her hand and say, I have an idea? No, she does not. Does the frontline law enforcement officer or the frontline corrections officer or the probation officer or the parole agent get to raise his or her hand and say, I'm in this problem. I see problems. Here's an idea to fix it. Well, when research is starting at $500,000, usually cresting over $1 million, they don't get to have their voices heard. There is no listening to those voices because we can't follow it with the research. So we had to find a way to make research less expensive to do. The other thing we do, oops, and I just bust right over my slide, and now it's frozen. Bear with me. Patience is not something that comes naturally to me. Is something we call data-driven innovation too. So we have 2 approaches to coming up with what we think are great ideas. The one is something that really parallels the work you just heard from Measures for Justice, and that is data-driven innovation. So we'll go into an organization and we'll say, hey, you get the top-level measures from Measures for Justice. We'll help you do a deep dive. Let's get really granular with your data. Let's look at those disparities in more detail. That's fine, I got it caught up. Because if you don't look at it in a much more detailed way, you might not be solving the right problem. So for example, we met a jurisdiction that had on measures found a disparity in the number of people who were diverted based on race ethnicity. So it looked as though there was a race divide in terms of who was diverted. But a closer dive into their data showed actually the number of diversion offers made were the same by race. What was different is the number of diversion offers accepted. Now, if you don't know that distinction, you're solving the wrong problem. The problem was that minorities did not like the sorts of offers that were being put to them. They didn't have enough faith in the system to begin with to take those offers. So we have this data-informed innovations, and we just heard about Christian Grosset from Winnebago, Wisconsin. We do not actually know each other. We both independently stumbled across this really rogue Republican elected district attorney in the middle of really nowhere. And he had come off of an event where Measures for Justice had released some of his data, and he said, well, I'm really interested in solving these problems. Where do we begin? So we sat down with him and said, oh, we'll help you do the deep dive, and we'll start innovating and testing with you on very aggressive timelines. So off the back end of one of the events, he spent 20 minutes with us at NYU. We brought in a data science team, and we showed him his data. Within 20 minutes, he had changed how he charges prostitution cases. Because we showed him his data in ways he'd never seen it before, and we paired him up with a forensic psychiatrist, adolescent psychiatrist. It was very hard to ignore when she's telling you what's happening to the brains of the people you're incarcerating now for all the wrong reasons. So it was really nice to see criminal justice reform happen on a 20-minute timeline. We are also very enthusiastic about, and there's been several of those, by the way, also on Data Driven from Santa Clara. We've just finished, I'm not allowed to talk about it now because I'll be in great trouble with my team, our first study, our first randomized control trial in California, where we have redacted race information before charging decisions are made. So prosecutors are blind to race ethnicity when deciding how they're going to press charges. That's hot off the press, stay tuned. We also really, really love client innovations. Some of the best initiatives we have were given to us by people from behind bars because they had the most invested in getting things right. Fascinating reforms. Again, these are voices that would otherwise never have been heard, and now they have inspired innovation in several states well beyond theirs because of the great ideas that they crafted with us collaboratively. We really do like the idea of staff innovations too. People who are often way down. You know criminal justice agencies, they are so hierarchical. The guy or the girl at the top gets to call most of the shots, and it's very unusual for people lower down those organizations who are really closest to the challenges to have a voice, and that's now changing. So we believe strongly in this idea of research done with people, not research done to people, and giving people voice. So this is one of my favorites. This is a true collaborative design. That is solitary confinement in Laurel Highlands, Pennsylvania. The first thing you'll notice is it doesn't look all that solitary. What is beautiful about this is that it started in a solitary housing unit in Washington State. I was focus grouping some men behind bars and saying, how can we improve solitary confinement? How can we reduce the numbers? How can we improve living conditions? And the biggest challenge they pointed out to me is that when you live in solitary and then you're asked to step into the general population, you are super anxious because you have lost the understanding of how to live in a relaxed way among others. So they asked for this kind of environment where they could kind of get their feet wet, learn to be free, and learn to just be relaxed among other people. And they created this unit that is now spreading across the country. A lot of people don't even go into solitary now because they just go straight in here. And people who have for years never wanted to come out of cells, watching them in that sort of environment are coming out. People who refuse to come out of cells. A very transformative program, collaboratively designed with mental health, corrections officers, and mostly importantly, the men behind bars. And now we have several of these sorts. I'm not sure why my other graphic is missing. One of my pictures does not like your system. We do lots of micro changes to the environment. And some people look at us and get frustrated thinking, why is NYU doing a lavender study in a mental health unit in prison? Or why are you changing out the lighting in that unit? Or why is the ceiling installation, top left is a ceiling, by the way, and it changes depending on the time of day. And I don't remember, the bottom left was a fish tank. Why are you bothering with these? Well, what we've noticed with these micro interventions, we talk about culture and changing culture. This is how you change culture. When you do these small things with people who are otherwise very resistant to change, they start to think about the environment differently. They start interacting with people differently. Big things come from small changes. We've definitely noticed that. we have a series of work right now, a series of studies right now, and I know I'm running out of time. We have a series of studies, which I'm not allowed to call this because I belong to a university. I'd really like to call them the give a shit studies, but I'm not allowed to. I've toned it down to give a crap studies, and I'm still getting the stink eye. The give a crap studies are when you just give a damn. And you try set up situations where you just give people the opportunity to have a little bit of dignity. All of those studies move the dial. And they cost next to nothing. So, for example, giving somebody choice within a prison system where they never get choice, it's an illuminating thing. Letting them choose the color of their bed linen, letting them choosing a cup, letting them choose all sorts of things along the way can be really transformative because it gets the conversations going. We're very interested in transition points, like moving people from custody into the community. How do you really do that effectively? How do you establish those first contacts before release so somebody doesn't go onto bench warrant status after release? One of my favorites, getting people talking about transition points, I was in Nashville last week, and actually I had to give a presentation that day, and it was really awful because it was a presentation with Bloomberg Associates in the room, and I cried, and I never cry. I'd just come from jail with some mothers who I'd followed them from cell through the reception area. As they changed into civilian clothing, these are still incarcerated mothers, they changed into civilian clothing, got into unmarked cars, and got to spend 2 hours with their kids in a neutral spot, and they get to do it every Thursday night. That's transformative change, who, by the way, came from a woman who comes from the Just Leadership Fellows, who herself had a history of incarceration, has designed such a beautiful program that the Sheriff's Office loves. These are transformative innovations, all being tested in rapid cycle research. We have lots of work right now looking at virtual reality, how to get people accustomed. If you've been down for 20 years, you need to learn how to cross a street. You need to remember to look left or right or someone's going to ride you over. So teaching small things, teaching how to go through a store and select among boxes of cereal, it's overwhelming. There's all sorts of tasks. We can even do job performance training with virtual reality now. It's also a really great tool to teach corrections officers, for example, how to administer Narcan, how to look for cues, how to step somebody down if they're about to experience a moment of crisis. So how it works, thanks to the Arnold Foundation, is you submit your idea to us, we vet it very quickly, we identify a point of contact, you immediately get a PhD methodologist peer, a statistician, a case manager, and a writer. Off you go. Our fastest trials launch within days. Our fastest ones complete within days. Some of them take 4 weeks, some of them take 8 weeks, some of them will take a few years. It depends on the project, but they don't all have to take the years and years and years that we usually see. To make this work, we launched what we call Pracademia. Once a month we have Pracademia sessions. We're starting to increase the through rate of those now. And essentially anybody who wants to do a trial with us anywhere in the country just comes into our network with us. We now have 400 people working with us across the country, moving the dial. They're essential to the way we can do research. This is rapid cycle research, so every time a pilot finishes, it just begins. This is a court hearing reminder in Monterey, California. We were able to reduce the no-show rate by 1/3 just by a text message. While we go into rapid cycle now, the next thing is, what should that text message look like? Should it be, who should it come from? Should it come from the public defender? Should it come from a peer? Should it come from the courts? Yeah, I got it. Now we're into rapid cycle. Here's the dashboard behind this. We go into the next phase. So the end of the first trial is the beginning of the next. Big idea, small idea, innovate with us. It's super fun. Voices can be included. Research doesn't have to be that slow. That a Cadillac research is really important, and we're not trying to diminish the importance of it. But on the side of that sort of Cadillac academic research, we have to have more nimble research that is more inclusive, faster timelines to give voices to those who usually don't. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Angela. I think the problem with Angela is she doesn't seem very excited about her work. So our first two speakers have spoken a bit about how data can be used across the spectrum, sort of for any issue or any measure. And now I want to turn to Dr. Goff, who is using data to focus in on one particular, very important, or I guess it's more than one, but an area of particular and particularly important problems. As I said before, Dr. Goff is the Franklin A. Thomas Professor in Policing Equity here at John Jay. When he was appointed to that post, the John Jay press release called him a renowned scholar and one of the nation's leading scholars on the phenomenon of implicit bias. Neither description is even remotely an exaggeration. He's co-founder of the Center here for Policing Equity, and really is an expert in a lot of different forms of racial bias and discrimination, as well as the intersections of race and gender. Dr. Goff serves as one of 4 principal investigators for the CPE's National Justice Database, the first national database on racial disparities in police stops and the use of force. Dr. Goff was a witness for the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing and has presented before members of Congress and congressional panels, Senate briefings, and White House advisory councils. Dr. Goff.
Thanks. I think he forgot that I was also best drawer in 3rd grade. It's very important to me. So I'm excited in part because I see so many synergies between, I mean, I've dealt with Measures for Justice before, and I've read reports from Beta, but I actually think that as we're thinking about data as a solution, that there are really deep themes here, and I'm excited to be talking about those as we move forward. So in the short time that I've got, I want to walk through sort of the urgency of using data to address police accountability, and the opportunities that I see in front of us. Is anybody going to think that I'm just a weirdo if I stand while I talk? No? Okay, fair enough. You said no, that's a little bit less incentivizing for me, but it's fine. So I'm going to do that through telling a couple of stories. The first story, when we first started doing this a little bit more than a decade ago, I was out in the Midwest talking with a police chief who said, Doc, I've got a problem. My racial profiling data are better in the city than they are in the county. But I have no idea what that means. I can't tell you if that means that the county is okay and we're awesome, if it means the county is terrible and we're just slightly better, if the county is terrible but we're great. I just can't tell you, right? But I can tell you that, if the clicker will work, we're 1 dead black teenager away from this whole city burning to the ground. And the worst part about this for me is we're a decade plus hence, and if I had said this was the West Coast or the South or the Mountain West or the Northeast, it's all just as plausible, right? This is everywhere. And to me, the reason why I start with this is it highlights a really important trilogy of problems we've got if we want to hold police accountable to the values that we say that we share. That trilogy looks like this. It's the context of policing in the US. Our definition of racism is massively outdated. That's first, right? Second, within that definition, we have no good way to measure bias, or at least the ways we've been measuring bias as opposed to disparity have been really, really bad. They've been aggressively bad and contributing to the problem. And the third part is we don't even have any good data to talk about that. So the title slide talks about the National Justice Database. That's been our attempt at a solution for dealing with each of these 3 problems. And so let me walk you through yet another story to get at least this defining of racism part first. So in terms of our definition being outdated, what if I told you that racial disparities in use of force, at least sometimes, are not about the bigotry of police officers? We're sophisticated people in this room. Nobody in here is going to be terribly surprised, right? So what if I told you instead, in some of those instances when it's not the bigotry of the officers, part of what's going on is officers are chronically in situations where they're being told their manhood is not sufficient. Or they're being told you're racist, which means you have no moral authority to subdue somebody, to talk somebody down. Anytime you want to get somebody to do something, you've got to use coercive physical force. If I told you those 2 things were true, then how would we go about finding it? How would we spot it? How would we hold folks accountable to it? So let me tell you about why I think some of these things are true. I'm going to tell you yet another story. I'm just going to be a storyteller up here, right? Because telling stories with data, that's kind of what we do. So very first randomized control trial we did, it was a lab experiment where we were looking at what causes racial disparities in police use of force. We used the use of deadly force simulation room in the Denver Police Department. We asked folks to come in and we showed them different videos of people of different racial backgrounds, okay? So the first guy I'm going to talk to you about, I'm never in the building when we do this, right? I've got graduate students and postdocs. I'm off doing other things. But this time I'm taking a tour of the police academy. And on my way out, I run into the chief, Chief Whitman at the time, and a district commander who many of you know and love, but who's now here in New York, Tracy Cassie. Right? So she's giving me the tour. We run into the chief, and on the way out the door, there's a guy in plain clothes who's here to take my study of racism and police use of force. He's in plain clothes. He walks up to the chief, looking at me, kind of confused. He says, "Hey, chief, who's the guy in the suit?" And the chief says, "That's Dr. Phil, because that's my curse." So then the guy starts looking at me very confused. He says, "Wait, you're the researcher?" I said, "Yeah." So do you like have a PhD? Yeah. So he's looking around confused. He says, "I'm sorry, guy. I don't like black people." "Thank you so much for coming to my study on racism and policing. Right this way, sir." So it turns out this guy that I'm telling you the story of, we're going to see him, how he responds in just a second. Turns out he's high on bias, right? Shocking no one. He's high on prejudice, explicit, high on implicit bias. He's high on aversive racism, modern racism, symbolic racism. If you discover a new form of racism, he's going to beat your high score. He trains in the off season. He's an Olympic gold medalist, okay? But he doesn't care that much about whether or not you think he's racist. He also doesn't care that much about what you think of his manhood. So he's high racism and low concern about racism, low concern with masculinity, responding to an aggressive black suspect. If I can have the camera off. During a simulation where the vast majority of officers did not pull the trigger. And the take home for this in terms of the definitions of racism that we use, if we're looking for bigots, which is how we normally go about doing this, then we bench the first officer, which by the way, I'm totally fine with. But we missed the second one. And that should be unacceptable to us. We need systems of accountability that deal with both. We need definitions of how racism functions that will deal with both. Okay. Now, this last part, or the second part in terms of, well, how are we going to measure this, right? How do we measure bias as opposed to disparity? In the United States, if there are multiple racial demographics within a city, the question is not whether or not there are disparities, it's why. Because there are going to be disparities. But the why part, we basically have been stuck with our chief from the Midwest saying, my racial disparity stats, my racial profiling stats are bad. By which, of course, he meant I compare my percentage of the population that I stop to the percentage of the population in the residential area that's black, and if they don't line up, I'm a racist. That's a terrible way to do an analysis. In my intro stats class, the technical term for that is stupid, right? We can do better than that. But what are the answers to why? Well, as we've been doing these analyses, it turns out there are basically three buckets that the explanations fall into. We've got community-level explanations, police-level explanations, and relationship-level explanations. By community-level explanations, what we're talking about are things that the community does, like crime, or things that happen to the community, like poverty or educational disparities. By police-level explanations, we're talking about police policies, police culture, or we're talking about individual officer attitudes, right? So prejudice actually does play a role. And by relationship level, we're talking about trust and fear between police and communities. Now, if you can explain all of these, you can start to get at why you end up with disparities and where we should be focusing like a laser on solutions. All right. That gets at how we measure bias, but what about the question of what data we should be collecting? Well, that's where the National Justice Database got started, but it's informed by these other two things as well. You got to have a theory for change if you're going to implement change, right? So the National Justice Database is, as Matt mentioned, it's the first and the largest database of police behavior in the world. It's a very low bar, but we're still proud. And we focus on three particular behaviors: pedestrian stops, vehicle stops, and use of force. We also collect information on complaints against officers and other information as police departments have it, but we were trying to keep it simple so police departments could give us the data they had and we could do something meaningful with it. Importantly, again, with commitments from, maybe I didn't say this part, it's more than a third of the United States by population. Not a single department that's worked with us so far has pedestrian, vehicle, and use of force data, all three. Not one. We combine these data with census and ACS data, as well as the crime data from the department, because you see our data are terrible. And the crime data from the department will have usually at least a street address, which we can correct into an XY coordinate. We then connect these data with department climate survey data. So we actually ask officers about how they feel about people in their community. We get measures of both explicit and implicit bias. But we also get measures of things like masculinity threat, like concern with being seen as racist. And we ask officers about their health and well-being, because it turns out healthy departments police more fairly. We then combine this, you thought it was done, with a policy analysis. So we get their general operating orders, and we're able to code that both for, we give a numeric, so a quantitative analysis on how rigorous is it, how clear is it, how easy is it to be understood, and how much accountability is there. If you screw up on this, how likely is something bad to happen to you? As well as a best practice analysis. How much, and I should say it should be promising practices, how much do you have regulations that look like they've worked elsewhere? But wait, there's more. Because in some places, we have just begun the process of doing residential surveys to integrate this in, okay? Where we can measure trust in law enforcement, bias of community members, and experiences with law enforcement, right, of the community. So what do you get from all of that? Well, there are three things I want to highlight. First is you can get context. Because if you imagine there's racial disparities in policing, which you don't really have to imagine, you can see them, why would you not imagine that there's racial disparities in employment, healthcare, education, housing, and the rest, all of which are going to happen upstream of any contact with law enforcement? But with these data, you can actually start to get an estimate of how much the disparities are due to police behavior alone, which means you can go back to the police department and say, hey, you've got disparities of this much, your problem. Start fixing it. You can even start saying where. We also get objectivity. We are, in fact, the justice nerds. And what that leads to next is opportunities for engagement. Because what we found frequently, any place that CPE goes to do the National Justice Database, the most important thing we do is anything at all. Once there's a process where people come together and they talk about, this is how we want to measure it, this is how we want to think about it, then they can start to trust the process when they can't trust each other. And then the better angels start winning more battles. All right. So remember I talked about the reasons why, the three different buckets: community level explanations, police, and relationship level explanations. I just want to walk you through that one more time to show you that with the National Justice Database, on that community level explanations, if we've got crime and the demographics, especially the ACS demographics, we kind of have what's going on in the community. For police level explanations, we want the policies, right? We want the culture, and we want the individual officers. Well, if you've got their policies, a climate survey, and individual officer level analyses, you kind of have that. And what about fear and trust? Well, if you've got the officer surveys and you've also got a survey of residents, you've got that too. Again, that allows for an analytic framework that's way more sophisticated than let me just compare my numbers to the population numbers and hope they match up well. So what does this look like in terms of a concrete example? So let me use an example of a story, or tell a story of research that we did in Austin that we think generalizes more broadly and tells the promise. So this is a project that we did with our partners at the Urban Institute. They were actually really core for getting all of this stuff done. We've been doing a lot of this work in collaboration with them. We also did it in collaboration with the Austin Police Department. This is a willing thing. We don't force data on departments or on communities. And in collaboration with the White House under the previous administration, surprising no one. So what we're able to do in a place like Austin is, I'll give you two neighborhoods. Okay, and imagine this not just in Austin, but across the 250 some odd departments that we currently have some data for. Neighborhood A and neighborhood B. So what do they look like? Well, neighborhood A, the crime rate is, let's say, 0.02% of folks are involved in crime. Let's just say. Same as neighborhood B. The high school graduation rate in neighborhood A is 46%, same as neighborhood B. The percent below the poverty level is 7%, same as neighborhood B. And in neighborhood A, home ownership is about 32%, same in neighborhood B. The only difference between neighborhood A and B, at least the way we're doing our regression models, is the percentage of the neighborhood that's black. That means any differences we see are not because of crime rate, education disparities, poverty, home ownership. We have a whole other bunch of covariates in here, but I ran out of slide room. But in neighborhood A, black population is 23%. Neighborhood B, it's 43%. In Austin, what this means is that if in 10% of the cases in neighborhood A, force is used, it's going to be 52% higher in neighborhood B. 52% higher. That's a meaningful thing. And it's something that law enforcement can't then come back and say, well, we just go where the crime is. We just go where the poverty is, right? As if criminalizing poverty and beating up poverty was a good thing to do. Still, that's one of the arguments that we see out there, right? And so in Austin, what they're able to do is they're able to say, all of the folks who are shift lieutenants, who are saying that's what they're doing, that's not sufficient to explain what we're seeing. You've got to do better. And they can start holding themselves accountable to the data they're already collecting. Now, you might be saying, research is slow. You might be saying, this is a really intensive investigation. How long does it take you guys to do this? Way, way, way too long, okay? This is why we have introduced the Google factor. or at least this is why we're excited to be introducing it. So some of you may know a number of months ago, we got a significant monetary investment from Google. If you get the opportunity, go ahead. It's awesome. But that matters nothing compared to what's going on right now at Chelsea Market, at Google's headquarters in New York. There are 10 software engineers locked in a cave building software for us. And what they're building is an automatic process to extract the data from police departments, to identify data irregularities, of which basically all the data are irregular, but then to standardize it and clean it automatically, to automate the analyses. I'm happy to say that they've started calling this process the Rick bot. Rick is our senior methodologist, so we're making him into a robot. He's excited about that. And they're even automating some of the English language explanations of the analyses. So how long did this kind of thing take us? To be honest, when we used to do it by ourselves, I used to take a bunch of PhD level researchers, cut off their eyelids, throw them in a cage, and then get to come out when it's done. And that took about 9 to 12 months. By the time that we're done with this, the estimate is it'll take about 9 to 12 minutes. We can now put this in the hands of every police department that really wants to know how good or bad they're doing, what part of this belongs to them. And here is a key part of the analytic framework and why we've been able to get unions on board, chiefs on board, and communities as well. Show me a community that thinks that they are engaged with biased law enforcement that doesn't also feel like there's racial prejudice and racial discrimination elsewhere in their lives and wouldn't want to know how much of that is influencing criminal justice outcomes. Anybody, I'm genuine, I'm not asking this rhetorically, I don't expect an answer, but if you know of a community that doesn't feel that way, please let me know. Similarly, if you work with law enforcement and you know of a chief that wouldn't like to be able to point to the part of the racial disparities in their outcomes that's not their fault, please let me know that chief. Okay? Folks get that these issues are more complicated than the public narrative, but they haven't had a technique for explaining it. This sets it up so that everybody is getting a win. By the way, for the unions, tell me a union head that believes that executives are listening to them about health and safety of their officers. We gotta have a survey that they have to listen to. So folks get a win out of this, and we actually don't get a whole heck of a lot of pushback, except please give it to us sooner. And Google's working on that. So with that, I think I'm done, and I'm pretty close to out of time, so thanks, and on to the next one.
All right, we are very short on time, and I imagine that there are loads of questions out in the audience, so I'll just turn to Adam Gelb. As I mentioned earlier, Adam directs Pew's Public Safety Performance Project, a mouthful, which helps states advance policies and practices in adult and juvenile sentencing and corrections that protect public safety, hold offenders accountable, and control corrections costs. In addition to policy work, they also have a very robust research portfolio, and I think among the many important projects they do, perhaps none is more prominent and more important than the justice reinvestment work that Adam and his team have been one of the most potent driving forces behind that. So, Adam.
Thank you, Matt. I've computed a quick data point to start this off, and that is that the people on this side of you speak at 56% of the speed of the people on that side of you. But I'll try to maintain that energy level here this afternoon. So you did ask me to talk about justice reinvestment. I will do that, but also talk about a second tool at Pew called the Pew MacArthur Results First Initiative. Both of which are initiatives that really try to marry data as closely as possible to the policymaking process. First, should I grab that clicker? I don't need it quite yet, but let me grab that from you. So first is justice reinvestment. And I should say JRI and the Results First Initiative fit together in a very clear way. It's not often apparent, but it's really simple. Justice reinvestment is about helping states figure out what policies will help safely reduce incarceration, and Results First is about what programs will help states safely reduce recidivism. Programs versus policies. So justice reinvestment is an intensive technical assistance project that Pew does in partnership with the Bureau of Justice Assistance and other partners, the CSG Justice Center, Crime and Justice Institute, and many others. And it happens in four phases that I'll run through quickly and then describe kind of how data fits in each of those phases. The first phase is what we call the assessment phase, and this is about a 3 to 6 month long we sometimes call it kind of a dance with state leaders. We are doing an initial look at their data. What are their trends that are seem to be driving their corrections populations, and so the data level look. We also do a political analysis, working our way up to eventually the governor and the Speaker of the House, the Senate President, and trying to assess their level of political willingness to actually engage in a meaningful data-driven process and use that data to drive a set of policy recommendations. So then sort of once Pew and BJA become convinced that there's a there, the state is ready, willing, and able to engage in that kind of process, the work begins. It begins with the establishment or designation of a bipartisan interbranch task force, usually 15, 17, 19 folks from all three branches of government, key stakeholders from the system and the community. The three phases begin. The first phase is what we call a data analysis and system assessment. The second phase is policy development, and then the third phase is the legislative phase. I'm kind of going to just use one of the most recent examples of this process, which happened in Louisiana, to illustrate. Louisiana was probably, I think, about the 36th state or so to have gone through the justice reinvestment process. Some have been through it 2 times or more, so I think we've done now 36 or so engagements, or about 44 engagements in 36 different states. So once we have this bipartisan task force formed, we're going to do a very deep dive into their data and try to pinpoint exactly what statutes, what policies, what practices are driving their prison population. And so, of course, right, we all know that there are 2 things and 2 things only that determine the size of a prison population. That's admissions and length of stay. So we start there. This is an example, again, from Louisiana here. One of the things that we'll do is to put the state in context with its neighbors or other similar states. So you'll see here an analysis that shows how Louisiana is fairly similar in terms of its admission rate to prison for violent offenses, but sticks out like a sore thumb when it comes to admissions to prison for nonviolent offenders there, and double, even triple the rate of some of its southern neighbors. And just picture this. Our team is sitting with slide decks like this, often 90, 110, 130 slides with speakers of the House and other senior folks in government. And we'll talk about this at the end, but they're lapping it up, generally speaking. And it's kind of a neat thing to see when they're able to dive into their data at this depth. We'll take a look, similar to what Caroline described, and be able to show variance by counties. I'm going to move through here quickly because of time. And then taking a deeper dive than just that pie chart that you're used to seeing, like what slice of the prison population is violent versus nonviolent. It takes a deeper dive and cuts it not just by offense type, but by prior record as well. And you can see here that a significant portion, over 85% really in each of these cases, of drug and property offenders who are being admitted to the Department of Corrections in Louisiana are folks who have had no prior contact with the Department of Corrections. That doesn't mean they're necessarily a first-time offender, but it means that this was their first admission to prison, and it was for a nonviolent offense, and they didn't have a prior violent admission to the prison system. So we do that kind of analysis of admissions. Moving on to length of stay here, you see compared to over this 10-year period, you saw in Louisiana a 51% increase in people who were serving less than a year, and more than a doubling of people who were being released after having served more than 10 years. So that's a starting point for a conversation about why is that happening? Are people being sentenced to shorter terms in the beginning and just churning? Or are people taking advantage of various earned time credits that were put in by a law a few years earlier? And so they were sentenced to maybe 2 years, but they're getting out after a year, right? So we have to, I'm not showing that here, but all this stuff gets an even deeper dive about exactly what is going on here. beneath those general offense categories, we've got the specific offenses here, and you can see again the 10-year trends that Louisiana was experiencing, with increases in some, decreases in others. What happens then is all of this gets rolled up. Once that analysis is done in that first phase, and the state starts to have a real nuanced picture of what's been driving their system, then we move into the policy development phase. We haven't been discussing policies at that point. You don't start telling them they need to divert their drug offenders or do this or that with different populations until you have the data. And once you do, you then start to sort of do what we call almost a shuttle diplomacy of working amongst the different stakeholders and folks on those task forces to forge consensus about which specific statutes and policies need to change. When we do that, we start to then simulate the impact of various different policy options. So you're not just saying, well, we want to change this, we want to change that, without having any idea what the impact on the prison population is going to be of those things. So for each individual policy prescription, it gets a micro simulation of the impact it'll have on the prison population. You get to consensus. You have a report generally that comes out from the legislature at the end of the year, December, going into the next legislative session, at which point all of those policies then get wrapped up into a policy package. And the last data piece there becomes trying to make sure that you're not double counting. That is, if you have policies that take people out of the system on the front end, you can't count them again if you're going to have release policies at the back end. So it's a very methodologically intense process with a lot of different moving pieces to try to make sure you're giving the state an accurate picture that says this set of recommendations that you've put together will have, with some confidence, this combined overall impact on the state's prison population. You see what Louisiana did here. Those are the actual numbers of the bill that passed in Louisiana. That top line there, absent reform, is what we call the cost of doing nothing. If they didn't change any policies, things came about as they would have. Otherwise, the population would have stayed relatively flat, grown a little bit over the 10-year period. You see that the combined impact of those policies would reduce that population by another 10%. With savings, we do the bed impact and also the cost impact. The cost impact of about a $250 million, 70% of which would be reinvested into savings in the community. So that was the real triumph in Louisiana. Obviously, the nation's most incarcerated state. Some very aggressive policies for violent offenders as well as nonviolent offenders in that state. So I don't know how to. Got to go back now. Can we hit? I want to shift gears real quick and just run through results first. You able to queue up that? You able to queue up that video? It's on. Yep. Just hit play. This is pretty straightforward, simple, but pretend you're a policymaker watching this. Uh-oh.
Should there be volume?
There should.
Visuals are stunning. Can you narrate?
I have not memorized this one. Flying the flag for our sister project, Pew MacArthur results first. Phil, you had audio.
I did.
Yeah. All right, let's, you want to skip it?
Don't you wish you were using a Mac like the rest?
Oh, shoot. Right.
Local governments are charged with some of the most important work in our society. The programs they provide to their residents touch every aspect of life, from education to healthcare to criminal justice and more. And it's essential that these programs achieve the best possible outcomes and get the most out of every tax dollar. But too often, policymakers lack the necessary information about which programs work which don't, and which provide the best bang for your buck, and are left to make crucial decisions with little to no data. The Pew MacArthur Results First initiative works with state and local governments to identify and invest in programs and policies proven to work. Results First helps government leaders access and assemble critical information about what works, beginning by developing a program inventory, a comprehensive list of all programs they provide in a given policy area. The program inventory pulls information like program name, description, participants, and budget into one centralized place. Once government leaders know what programs they're funding, the next step is to understand how effective those programs are. There's a lot of information about program effectiveness out there, but it's not easy to find. So Results First created a clearinghouse database, a collection of research from various national clearinghouses, which display programs according to their level of effectiveness. Policymakers can search this wealth of information to assess the programs they're providing and see if they are proven to work. They can also use it to explore other effective programs they could offer. Knowing what is currently being done, how effective it is, and what it costs is essential to deciding how to allocate limited resources. For some of the programs identified in the inventory, Results First can help partners use our model to assess the benefits and costs they can expect their programs to have. The model calculates the projected impact of a program, taking into account the specifics of their state or locality, including population characteristics, costs, and other variables. Finally, Results First enables governments to use all of this data and evidence to make more informed policy and budget decisions, reducing funding programs with little evidence of impact and shifting funding to alternatives that can achieve better outcomes. By bringing evidence into the decision-making process, Results First helps policymakers improve outcomes for their residents and make the most of limited resources. To learn more about the Pew MacArthur Results First initiative, go to pewtrusts.org/resultsfirst.
I have a friend who, when he's saying something important, he speaks very softly. Or at least when he thinks he's saying something important, speaks something very softly. I always thought it was purposeful. Lean in and pay attention. Thank you for enduring that. Results First started in the criminal justice arena. It's actually a little bit embarrassing, I think, for criminal justice people that a guy who's an economist out at the Washington State Institute for Public Policy, who is a generalist, he actually studied the electric grid before coming to the criminal justice arena, was able to see the forest through the trees and say, hey, you guys have all these evaluations of all these programs, and nobody's sort of put them together and said what they really mean. And so he figured out to do meta-analyses and put those effect sizes together across programs and come up with what he calls consumer reports, essentially, for criminal justice programs. His name is Steve Oss. And so he pioneered this approach that Pew and MacArthur now have injected some additional funding into and expanded into areas beyond criminal justice and to substance abuse and mental health programs and education programs and other things. For our purposes, though, if you haven't seen this, it's worth Googling and checking out. This is just digest that as best you can. There'll be a test on this tomorrow. Just a quick overview of the kind of programs you see: reentry courts up here, and electronic monitoring, mental health courts, and other interventions here. And as you see on the columns, just quickly, we'll show when they did the meta-analysis, what the total benefits of delivering that program to an offender are, and then subdividing out those benefits to taxpayers, specifically in terms of actually out-of-pocket government costs versus non-taxpayer benefits or social benefits, including to victims. And then the total cost of the program. On the other side is the benefits, which flow from the effect size of the program that come from that meta-analysis. Then, of course, the all-important cost-benefit ratio. Here's a little bit, sort of a simplified version of this. that you can see in a number of different areas to just get a feel for what that tool is able to do. In a general sense, so just quickly, there are about 25 states now that in some way, shape, or form have this tool and are able to populate those program costs and benefits with their own data. So it comes preloaded with the national values. So if drug courts, the meta-analysis say get about an 8% reduction in recidivism, and you've done some evaluations in your state that say we get about an 18% reduction on average for this offender type, you can plug that in. Same thing with the cost and make those adjustments. At the end of the day, you're able to sort of optimize your spending on criminal justice programs. So Matt, we'll finish up with that.
All right. Thank you. So I promised 15 to 20 minutes of questions. We have about half of the low end of that estimate, so I apologize. But I think, do we have folks circulating with mics?
There's a mic there.
Oh, okay, there's one there. So if people have questions, please go up to one of the mics. Please introduce yourselves and the organization that you're representing, and also please ask questions. Questions, not statements. Oh.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi.
I guess.
No. Thank you. My name is Amanda Boog. I'm a fellow with the Quattrone Center at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. I recently moved to Philadelphia from Texas, where I started a project called the Texas Justice Initiative, where I published data on over 7,000 deaths in custody in Texas. And so part of my question has to do with data policy. And so we've kind of seen like how third parties are making an impact in making data more available to researchers and also to the public. But obviously there's a government role here to play as well. How do we parse that out? What is the role for third parties, and what are the respective roles at the different levels of government, especially now thinking that the BJS will probably not be playing as big a role as it had kind of promised it would be playing like a year or two ago. So what are the role kind of respectively of the local governments and states as well in collecting and making available this data that's so important?
Jeez, we probably all have something to say about this. I think coming from Measures for Justice point of view, our goal really is also that data begets better data, right? So I think as we start having these conversations, there needs to be there needs to be action for bills that address collecting better data, open data, transparent data. There needs to be, I think, resources backing the tracking and accessibility to data. You can't just tell the police department to track better data and not give them a CAD system that tracks data. So I think it's the role for me is that I think these state level governments need to really step up in their bills that address, access and reliable data, basically.
So you were asking the relative role of government, and so I would respond that it's the same as everything else that the public needs, right? First you have to educate that the public needs it. They need to understand the benefit of it. They need to see the benefit of it, and then they need to make it impossible for anybody to hold office and not make it a priority. So at this point, we work with state legislatures, state AGs, governor's offices, because this is a state, at least my part, we do education and law enforcement, but both are state-by-state issues. Those are folks who want to do the right set of things. It's their, their principled priority or their legislative priority. But in other places, we're getting calls from folks who are getting calls. Right? We're getting calls from folks where their municipality is really fired up about this and they want change, and they have educated themselves to the point where they understand they can't hold their elected officials accountable without those data, so they're going to hold their elected officials accountable for collecting it. And I think we're going to be in that position for quite a while, where it needs to be on the outside, and not just because of the federal administration, right? But it needs to be an outside game until the inside decides that they've got either the capacity or the will to get it done.
More questions?
Hi. Hello? Hi. Sorry about that. My question is just how how you think we can avoid overselling, you know, a statistical silver bullet solution. How can we avoid becoming a, you know, just a CompStat 2.0 that ends up blowing up in our faces? And, you know, how can we can work towards a long-term solution?
I'll take a quick stab at that. I think one of the nice things about, you know, the taste for data seems to be infectious. When you work with an agency and they start to value data, the thought of going back to a non-data universe is almost unimaginable for them. And data is very exposing. So if you have a silver bullet solution, it's very hard for it to persist if agencies are collecting data, right? Particularly as we start to see, I mean, we have a similar project now where we start to look at these kind of automated evaluation tools similar to your pre-leasing project. It becomes very hard when an agency has at its own disposal in a 10 or 12-minute timeline the opportunity to assess what the impact of that program X silver bullet is. So it's very hard to not shine light on something in an environment where it's becoming easier and easier. The challenge with the data is actually the input side, right? Because you have to have that person, I mean, the data is only as good as the people who bother to input the data. Getting the cultural taste for data on the entry-level side, the systems analysis side is actually a relatively easy fix we're starting to see now. I mean, it was complicated, but every week it's getting easier and easier to help those agencies visualize their data, figure out how to clean their data in these kind of automated ways. So we're getting very close to the point where it's going to become very hard to keep crappy programs on the books. We're not there yet, but we're moving in that direction.
I think we can take one more.
Hi, my name is Kristen. I'm with the Southern Coalition for Social Justice in North Carolina. We do a lot of voting rights and criminal justice reform, and I do a lot of communication work on that side, so I try to use data to inform a lot of our followers. For example, with pretrial detention, I use New York Times data visualization and almost like a quiz of what would happen to you based on your circumstances. I was wondering if you all know of any groups that create data communication tools like that, especially for the upcoming census. That's one communication issue we're having both for voting rights and criminal justice reform, is showing people data-wise how their lives will be impacted based on past census changes.
Any ideas?
If only because someone has to give an answer, apparently. I don't know of any organization whose job it is to do that, but I will say that fairly early on in our work, we came to recognize the value of a strong communications team that understood how to work with data. So we work with a communications team, Sophia Jafari-Simmons consulting organization, that has been lovely at taking our nerd speak and turning it into pretty charts and graphs that make people understand. You may have just identified a massive niche that needs to be filled, but at the very least, there are communication shops that, if you understand what the story is, can help get it out.
I'd add one thing to that, and that is the power of universities in this. You know, one nice thing about being based at a university is you have this massive talent pool who are very good at creating visuals. They aren't always good, and if you pair them with the others who have the kind of the artistic talent and the communication skills, you can really make magic at a relatively low cost. So I'd encourage you to seek out those very hungry grad students who are so good at this and give them an ear. And feed them.
Great. I'm sorry that the time has been so brief for Q&A. I haven't asked permission to do this of the panelists, but if you want to ask us more questions, they won't run out of the room immediately, so please come up. But please join me in thanking this wonderful panel.